Hello and welcome to Unbuilt Giants, a series that looks at the development and demise of some of history's most notable and sometimes bizarre skyscraper projects. The Plan Voisin was an ambitious and controversial urban redevelopment proposal conceived by Franco-Swiss architect Le Corbusier in 1925 as a radical solution to the social and spatial problems of central Paris. Rooted in his earlier theoretical work, the plan sought to replace much of the historic right bank, including the densely populated Marais district, with a gridded expanse of cruciform skyscrapers, open green spaces, and segregated traffic systems. Designed to accommodate the modern age of machines, hygiene, and efficiency, Plan Voisin envisioned a Paris stripped of its medieval street patterns and architectural heritage, rebuilt as a functional, orderly city of the future. Though never implemented, the proposal became a cornerstone of modernist urban thought and a lightning rod in the debate over preservation, modernization, and the role of architecture in shaping society. Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, who would later adopt the name Le Corbusier, was born in 1887 in the small Swiss town of La Chaux-de-Fonds, nestled in the Jura Mountains. This town, known for its watchmaking industry and precise craftsmanship, provided a fitting backdrop for the early life of a man who would become one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. Initially trained as an engraver at the local art school, Jeanneret's early exposure to design and technical skill laid the foundation for his eventual transition to architecture. His interests quickly expanded beyond decorative arts, and under the guidance of notable teachers such as Charles Le Platinier, he began to explore architectural theory, traveling through Europe to observe major architectural works firsthand. He studied the classical ruins in Greece and Rome and later absorbed lessons from modern innovations in cities like Berlin and Vienna, experiences which deeply shaped his developing aesthetic sensibilities. By the early 1910s, he had moved to Paris, a city that would become central to his intellectual and professional life. It was in Paris that he came into contact with influential figures such as Auguste Perret, who introduced him to the expressive possibilities of reinforced concrete, and with whom he studied structural rationalism. He also briefly worked in the office of Peter Behrens, alongside other emerging modernists like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius. This period marked a decisive turn in Jeanneret's thinking as he began to conceive of architecture not merely as a visual or ornamental pursuit, but as a means of shaping society itself. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 saw Le Corbusier return to Switzerland, where he spent much of the war teaching at the La Chaux-de-Fonds art school. Far from a retreat, these years were intellectually fertile. It was during this time that he began to formulate the theoretical foundations of what would become modernist architecture. Drawing on both the industrial efficiency of modern engineering and the clarity of classical form, he began to articulate a vision of architecture rooted in rationality, standardization, and universal principles. He imagined buildings as functional machines, streamlined for modern living. His now famous dictum that "a house is a machine for living in" was not a rejection of beauty, but a redefinition of it. One in which beauty arose from clarity, purpose, and the honest expression of structure and materials. Reinforced concrete, steel, and glass became for him the essential materials of a new architecture suited to the age of mass production and industrial society. In 1922, Le Corbusier presented what would become a pivotal milestone in his career and in the history of urban planning. The Ville Contemporaine, or Contemporary City for 3 million inhabitants. The project was not a site-specific proposal, but rather a conceptual prototype for a modern, efficient metropolis. It featured a rigid, orthogonal grid structure designed to impose order on the perceived chaos of existing urban environments. The design was defined by uniform cruciform skyscrapers rising high above expansive open spaces, broad boulevards, and systematically planned residential zones. These towers, supported by standardized construction methods, were intended to house both residential and office functions, and were complemented by lower-rise Renaissance-style housing, wide roads, green belts, and carefully designated functional zones. The design emphasized the segregation of pedestrians and vehicles and was predicated on the belief that architectural form and city planning could engineer a healthier and more rational society. Though still speculative and idealistic, this model laid the intellectual foundation for what would become Le Corbusier's most provocative intervention into the real fabric of a historic European city. By 1925, Le Corbusier translated the abstract geometries of the ville contemporaine into a real-world proposal for the very heart of Paris. Taking advantage of the publicity offered by the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, he launched the Plan Voisin, named in honor of Gabriel Voisin, a pioneer of aviation and Le Corbusier's supporter and benefactor. This plan proposed the wholesale demolition and reconstruction of a vast swathe of central Paris, around 571 hectares, specifically targeting the densely built right bank, including large portions of the 3rd and 4th arrondissements, which encompassed the historic Marais district. In place of the tangled medieval street network and deteriorating housing stock, Le Corbusier envisioned a gleaming, rationalist metropolis of 18 identical 60-story cruciform towers. These were to be surrounded by vast green esplanades, interconnected by motorways and wide avenues designed to accommodate the growing dominance of the automobile. The layout followed a grid-based logic, interrupted by broad diagonal thoroughfares intended to link Paris directly with other major French and European cities. At the center of the plan, where two monumental traffic axes intersected, stood a proposed transportation hub anchoring the whole city in a new node of mobility and administration. The Plan Voisin was not simply a design experiment. It was driven by a clear and urgent critique of the existing urban conditions in Paris. Le Corbusier's motivations were deeply tied to the deteriorating state of public health, living conditions, and social cohesion in the capital. By the late 19th century and into the early decades of the 20th, Paris was already struggling with significant socio-economic divisions. While many European cities saw the wealthy retreat to the suburbs, Paris was unusual in that the bourgeoisie largely remained in the center. This left working-class Parisians, many of whom were unable to afford rising rents, to settle in the poorly serviced periphery or in overcrowded, unsanitary districts closer to the city's core. The Haussmannian reforms of the mid-19th century, though often lauded for their monumental boulevards and symmetrical facades, had also reinforced socio-spatial segregation by cutting new roadways through the old city, displacing poorer residents, and reinforcing barriers between neighborhoods. What remained of the medieval quarters, narrow alleys, dilapidated tenements, minimal light and ventilation, were prime breeding grounds for disease. Tuberculosis, in particular, was rampant in these densely packed slums, leading to widespread concern about public health and urban hygiene. For Le Corbusier, these conditions illustrated not just the failure of Parisian architecture, but a broader societal collapse that could only be reversed through decisive top-down intervention. He viewed the Plan Voisin as a surgical solution, a clean break from the ills of the past that could usher in a new, healthy, and efficient urban future. Only a small fraction of the entire area designated in the Plan Voisin was intended to be occupied by buildings. Specifically, just 12% of the proposed site was to be developed with structures, while the remaining 88% was reserved for open spaces, green zones, and broad traffic corridors. Of this modest built-up portion, approximately half was designated for residential purposes, with the other half allocated to commercial, administrative, institutional, and transportation facilities. This restrained footprint was central to Le Corbusier's vision of a city that prioritized openness, sunlight, and hygiene, offering a stark contrast to the dense and narrow medieval street network it was meant to replace. Automobile traffic, rather than being dispersed throughout the urban fabric, was to be directed through a carefully orchestrated system of elevated motorways. The most significant of these was a monumental 120-meter-wide arterial road running from east to west, slicing through the city as a linear infrastructural backbone. This highway intersected with a major north-south route at a central node, conceived as a modern interchange that would serve as both symbolic and logistical heart of the city. The design ensured a strict separation of movement. While motor vehicles occupied these raised, high-capacity thoroughfares, pedestrian traffic was to be channeled through elevated walkways set among trees, shielded from noise and fumes. These paths connected directly to the bases of the cruciform towers, which stood isolated within landscaped clearings, enhancing both accessibility and visual impact. The construction of the buildings themselves was to rely on the modern industrial materials that defined early 20th century architectural innovation: reinforced concrete, steel, and glass. These materials were chosen not only for their structural capabilities and aesthetic qualities, but also for their suitability in standardized, repeatable construction. The use of prefabricated components and modular systems was intended to streamline the building process, reduce costs, and enable mass production. This approach reflected Le Corbusier's belief that architecture should be treated with the same logic and precision as industrial production. His infamous notion of the house as a machine for living in was manifested here on a city-wide scale. Beyond the core business zone, which was dominated by 18 60-story cruciform towers, the plan extended westward to include a secondary zone, referred to as Sector D, which featured an additional 8 skyscrapers of identical form and function. To the southwest, Sector C was designated primarily as a residential district, composed of buildings arranged in a redent formation, a zigzag plan intended to allow for privacy, sunlight, and airflow. This sector incorporated preserved elements of the historic urban landscape, particularly the facade lines along Rue de Rivoli, to maintain a visual continuity with the past, even as the spatial logic of the city was fundamentally restructured. Linking these various sectors was a subterranean transport interchange, situated beneath the Palais Royal. This station was conceived as a central hub, connecting different modes of transit, including underground trains and road systems, facilitating rapid movement across the reimagined city and integrating with regional infrastructure. Although the Plan Voisin called for the clearance of large parts of central Paris, it did not advocate for indiscriminate demolition. Le Corbusier identified and sought to preserve 26 individual structures of architectural or cultural significance. Chief among these were religious and civic buildings such as the Church of Saint-Eustache, the Théâtre du Châtelet, the Paris Bourse, and the Palais Royal. These structures, many of them Gothic or classical in style, were to be retained as isolated monuments within expanses of greenery, liberated from their congested surroundings but simultaneously divorced from their historical context. Le Corbusier's intention was to enhance their visibility and symbolic value, even at the cost of their urban fabric. Despite the coherence of its conceptual framework and the urgency with which Le Corbusier addressed the challenges of modern urban life, the Plan Voisin was ultimately never realized. From the outset, it provoked intense opposition, particularly among city officials, architects, preservationists, and cultural commentators. The sheer scale of demolition it proposed, entire historic districts of Paris, including much of the Marais and Les Halles, was seen as an unforgivable erasure of the city's identity. Paris, with its layered architectural heritage, from medieval alleyways to Haussmannian boulevards, represented to many not just a living city, but a collective cultural treasure. The prospect of replacing this with uniform, cruciform skyscrapers arranged in a rigid grid, interspersed with motorways and vast open spaces, was perceived as an act of aesthetic violence. Le Corbusier's critics viewed the plan not as a visionary urban improvement, but as a mechanistic imposition that neglected the complexities of lived experience, social texture, and the symbolic resonance of place. Public resistance, though not always directly mobilized, aligned with a broader sentiment of reverence for the existing cityscape. The preservationist mood of the interwar period, especially in cities like Paris, where memory and identity are strongly tied to the built environment, favored continuity over rupture. Le Corbusier's disdain for the picturesque and his call to wipe away centuries of accumulated form in favor of a radiant city was, to many, not modernization but desecration. His promotional efforts, though prolific and relentless, including impassioned manifestos, influential writings in journals like L'Esprit Nouveau, and a dramatic diorama exhibited in the pavilion of the Esprit Nouveau at the 1925 Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs, did not change the fact that his vision required the destruction of too much that was loved. The plan made Le Corbusier infamous and helped secure his position as a central figure in the architectural avant-garde, but it failed to gain official backing. Yet while Plan Voisin never broke ground in Paris, its influence would spread across continents in the decades that followed. The post-war construction boom, driven by rapid urbanization, housing shortages, and a political appetite for large-scale state planning, proved fertile ground for the adoption of Le Corbusier's urban principles. The tower in the park model, characterized by high-rise blocks surrounded by green spaces, zoned strictly by function and organized for efficiency, found echoes in the design of La Cité de la Mouette in Drancy, the earliest manifestation of the plan's ideas on French soil. Although this housing complex would later gain infamy as a transit camp during the Second World War, its initial architectural vision was directly aligned with the rationalist, modernist logic of the Voisin model. In Paris itself, the spirit of the Plan Voisin surfaced most visibly in the La Défense business district. Conceived in the mid-20th century, this development introduced a cluster of glass and steel towers on a vast concrete plinth west of the historic city core, creating a visual and ideological counterpoint to the traditional urban fabric. The district's form, monolithic, elevated, and deeply structured by car traffic, was a muted, partial realization of Le Corbusier's unbuilt dream. Elsewhere in the city's suburbs, especially in areas experiencing waves of rural and colonial migration, sprawling estates of functionalist high-rises sprang up, echoing the Plan Voisin's emphasis on density, rational layout, and standardized housing typologies. Internationally, Le Corbusier's influence was even more pronounced. In Brazil, Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa's design for Brasilia incorporated principles lifted directly from the Athens Charter and Plan Voisin, including monumental axial planning, sectoral zoning, and residential superblocks. In the Netherlands, the Lekmirand housing scheme in Leeuwarden sought to emulate the clarity and modernity of Le Corbusian planning, but by the end of the century, it had become associated with social decay and urban failure. Much of it was later demolished or redeveloped, an implicit rejection of the very ideals it had once championed. By the 1990s, the Plan Voisin had acquired a dual reputation. On the one hand, it was a foundational text in the history of modern urbanism, a bold, uncompromising response to the dilemmas of the 20th century city. On the other, it had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of abstraction and authoritarianism in city planning. Its aesthetic starkness and detachment from historical context served as warnings against technocratic hubris and the reduction of cities to diagrams. Yet the debate it triggered remained vital. The tension between innovation and conservation, between the desire to improve cities and the need to protect their identity, remains central to contemporary urban discourse. Paris was spared the full realization of Le Corbusier's vision, but fragments of the Plan Voisin persist not only in its skyline, but in the urban philosophies that continue to shape the global metropolis. The plan's legacy is not merely architectural, it is ideological, continuing to animate questions of how to reconcile the past with the future in the ever-evolving story of the city. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for more episodes coming soon. See you next time.